right, let's go. Hey, welcome to the first 2024 meeting of the Water Commission. I'm Scott Servo. I'm the chairman. MJ, could you take the roll, please?
Senator Servo?
Here.
Senator Marsden? Here. Senator Stewart?
Here.
Senator Perry? Senator DeStaff? Delegate Lopez?
Here.
Delegate Bulova?
Here.
Delegate Hodges?
Here.
Delegate Krizik?
Here.
Delegate Rasul? Delegate Tran?
Here.
Delegate Clark? Delegate Laufer?
Here.
Mr. Curtis?
Here.
Mr. Bayford?
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum?
Great. Thank you, MJ. Well, welcome everybody to our first meeting of the year. You can see we have about 8 items on the agenda for today. I think we got a lot of good work done last year. A few things included in the budget, and a few things we passed that didn't get included in the budget. We'll get an update on those later. And I just want all the members to think about if there's any additional agenda items you'd like to add for the rest of the year. Please be thinking about it, and maybe talk after the meeting. We can see what else we can get done this year. The first thing we need to do is, it's the tradition of this commission at least, that the chairmanship alternate between the House and the Senate, I think on a 2-year basis, has been the way we've done it. I took over for Delegate Bulova, I think, last year, and we need to elect a new vice chair in light of the changes in the House of Delegates. At this point, I'd entertain a motion or a nomination, I guess, for election of a vice chair.
Move to nominate Paul Krizik.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and nominated that Delegate Krizik be elected vice chair. Are there any other nominations? Okay, having heard none. All those in favor of Delegate Krizik say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? No. Congrats, Delegate Krizik, or condolences, as the case may be.
Thank you.
All right, we have a vice chair. Now, the second thing we need to do is we need to adopt an electronic meetings policy so that if any of us need to attend remotely, we have a policy in place in the future so that can be authorized. MJ, or who should I ask? Oh, no, sorry. Why don't we go through the policy? Council, can you explain it for us?
Mr. Chairman, what you all have before you now is an update to the meeting policy that reflects a change to the FOIA laws. This is in regard to the maximum amount of time that this body can hold all virtual public meetings. So currently, the limit is 2 times per year, or 25% of the meetings held per year, calendar year, whichever is greater. Effective July 1, the 25% will now be increased to 50%. This change is reflected in the meeting policy under the all virtual meeting section on page 2 in the first paragraph, and also in number 9 on page 3.
Okay, these are changes that I guess are required because of changes to state law, Ms. Cottrell?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. And so, does anybody have any questions about the new electronic meeting policy?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stewart, you have a question?
Is this the model policy from the FOIA Council? Just curious.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, I am not sure. This is brand new, going into effect July 1.
I think it is.
Okay. Any other questions? Can we have a motion to adopt this as a policy?
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. We adopt this as the policy. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? No. Okay. We have the policy adopted. All right. On to number 3. So number 3 we have up on the agenda is consideration of Senate Bill 730, which is my bill, which was a bill about living shoreline stabilization. And just to give the committee some background on this, I can't remember the year, but I think it was actually then Senator Northam passed legislation about living shorelines. Then Senator Lewis adopted or passed legislation, I want to say in 2020, mandating a living shoreline approach where it was practical when you're building a new shoreline or completely replacing one. And since that time, they've been implementing the law. And the area that I represent, along with Delegate Krizik and formerly Delegate Tran, we had some complaints from a lot of residents who lived along the Potomac about the way grandfathering rules worked if you wanted to replace an existing structure that was already in place. And Delegate Krizik put in legislation 2 years ago, I think, 3 years ago, what was to repeal the law? Or
Yeah, somewhat will repeal it.
it was kind of a repeal that failed in the House. Then I put in a bill this year asking VRMC to adopt regulations clarifying what kind of structures were grandfathered. That bill is attached in your packet. That was referred here to the Water Commission for us to look at and study. And so I've asked for presentations here from Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Vera MC, and then one of our local residents in Mount Vernon to sort of educate the commission on what the policy is and what the dispute might be. And so I guess, Jay, you're first on the presentation agenda here. Why don't you come on up and tell us about non-living shoreline stabilization structures?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Jay Ford with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Really grateful for the chance to discuss this bill. As the chairman mentioned, this has been an issue that has come up in a couple of general assemblies at this point. I really want to thank the chairman and Delegate Krizik for being responsive to their constituents' concerns and trying to offer solutions to this issue. I will say as a means of introduction that, as you all know, session doesn't always provide the space that is necessary to have the detailed conversations needed. And a lot of times when you pass something new, everyone gets their what ifs out and says, what is this going to do to me? And the 2020 legislation from Senator Lewis on living shorelines is an example of where the what ifs kind of got ahead of the facts. And so unfortunately, we've had some concerns raised that the legislation could impact someone's right to repair an existing shoreline, when in reality, Virginia's right to repair has remained constant for decades, and nothing in the 2020 legislation changed that in the slightest. So I'd like to just briefly touch on why we made that change for living shorelines, what the 2020 legislation actually did, and then finally a brief response to the proposed bill, SB 730, and how that would fit into the landscape.
Okay, Jake, hold on one second. Just want to make sure all the commission members know that you all have a copy of this PowerPoint in front of you, so you don't have to follow on the screen necessarily. Go ahead, Jay.
Thank you. All right, so for most of you, you're aware why Virginia has such a strong position on living shorelines, and the chairman did an excellent job giving a legislative history. Virginia did start with a bill from Senator Northam that made living shorelines our preferred shoreline treatment. That was sort of our first stab at saying we'd like you to do more living shorelines for all of these reasons, because Virginia, they help us with water quality, they help us with fisheries habitat, as well as terrestrial creature habitat. Number three, I think, is really one of the most important ones for us right now, is that living shorelines allow us to do long-term planning when it comes to climate adaptation in a way that hardened shorelines simply do not. And a big piece of the 2020 legislation was focused on that long-term planning piece. And then number four, I think that one could be a subjective call, but I think they're prettier, and I think that shouldn't count for something along our coastlines. And then finally, they do absorb wave energy, and that's a really big deal, because in those places where we've hardened the entire shoreline, when we have high energy events, the waves don't just magically dissipate when they run into a hardened surface. They bounce back out and they'll scour the bottom of the body and have additional habitat impacts. So hardened shorelines really have put a lot of our waterways in serious disrepair, and have also tied an arm behind our back in a lot of our climate adaptation work here in Virginia. So in just as a little more background, in 2000, Virginia, as a Bay program partner, committed to achieve a no net loss of existing wetlands. And this is really important, because when we talk about the right to repair, I think there's a nuance that a lot of people are missing, and that's that the right to repair in Virginia, and you'll hear in more detail during Ms. Peabody's presentation, is limited to the footprint. So if you have a seawall, if you have a bulkhead, you can repair your bulkhead, but you cannot repair your bulkhead and destroy wetlands. And that is not because of the 2020 law, it's because Virginia has a no net loss standard. So if you have an impact on wetlands, you have to mitigate for them. And that has been the case long before the 2020 bill came into place. So I think it's important we draw that distinction, that in Virginia, it's very clear cut that if you have a shoreline treatment and you fix it and it's the same footprint, you don't need a permit, and that has always been the case. But if you are going to impact wetlands, you will have to mitigate, and that has also always been the case. And the 2020 legislation changed none of those facts.
Yeah, go ahead, Delegate Hodges.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you're saying if you don't have a permit, you don't need a permit to repair, but even if you damage wetlands, you need to mitigate for the wetlands, but you still don't need a permit, is what you just said, I believe.
I apologize if that came out that way, Delegate. You do need a permit if you're going to have an impact on wetlands. That is.
You need a permit then to be able to mitigate, but you can still repair, but you
you
just have to mitigate.
Yes, you will.
Still repair.
But you can still repair.
Not be forced to go with a living shoreline.
You can repair. I think I'm going to let Ms. Peabody speak to the particulars of this as the commission, and she can walk you through the process in more detail. But the distinction is you don't need a permit until you impact wetlands. If you are impacting wetlands, then that's a state resource. You absolutely want the local wetlands board or the Marine Resource Commission to take a look at it and make sure that we're either mitigating appropriately, or in a place like where you and I live, the proposal to say, let me just build back to an existing shoreline. I got shoreline treatments 40 feet out in open water because we've been treating shorelines for hundreds of years. It is very open-ended. And in those instances, we clearly don't want the agency saying, sure, because there was a bulkhead here, you can build back to it. So I think we need to make it, it needs to be clear that the agency should, in conjunction with VIMS, be able to make that determination when wetlands are impacted.
Okay, Delegate Hodges, make sure you go through the chair. Go ahead. Go ahead.
You know, because I know there's an AG opinion on the right to repair.
Mm-hmm.
But at what point, does, if you, with the AG's opinion, you still have the right to repair, but then you can mitigate to offset that and still repair. I mean, I'm just wondering, we may have to hear from the agencies on how that's handled.
Yeah, and I think Ms. Peabody's presentation will help answer your questions. Okay. But if you still have a question afterwards, I think we can try and answer it. The other things I do want to highlight, because this really drove the 2020 policy. Again, in 2011, we adopted the preference for living shorelines, but it didn't really move the needle. And as you will see in Ms. Peabody's presentation, since adoption of the 2020 legislation, we've finally seen significant uptick in the adoption of living shoreline as a shoreline treatment. So Virginia is also committed through the Bay Agreement to the goal of restoring 30,000 acres and enhancing 150,000 acres. However, year to year, we are continuing to go in the wrong direction. And one of our main commitments in WIP 3, our watershed implementation plan that we gave to the EPA, was that we were going to tackle this living shoreline issue. And that is really what drove the 2020 legislation. It was a direct result of our Bay obligations.
Serge, I had one quick footnote. I wanted to see if you could confirm. I believe Maryland adopted a mandatory living shoreline law before 2011. Is that right?
They did. Maryland was ahead of us out of the gate, and they've had a lot of success. I will say that generally, though, they have a more heavy hand when it comes to coastal planning than Virginia does, so they have more tools at their disposal when tackling their wetlands targets. So Virginia needed a tool that was a right fit for our strong personal property approach.
Okay, thanks.
So we've already talked about this a lot, so I won't beat the dead horse of tidal wetlands legislation of 2020, but I do want to point out it really just did two main things. So one was to take us from a preference to saying we will only approve living shorelines unless the best available science shows that such approaches are not suitable, and we went around and around on that language. We landed on the best available science and identified the Virginia Institute of Marine Science as our Office of Advisory Services, given their statutory obligations to advise the Virginia General Assembly and the agencies as the arbiter. And that was a really important point, is we realized if we did this and we didn't find an entity where the buck stops, that we would be in a situation where people were lobbying for the outcomes they wanted, and they would be able to go out and hire the engineer that gave them the answer they wanted, and we would end up with people with means being able to do an end run on the intent of this legislation. So there needed to be someone who could look at all of the different sides, the homeowners' perspective, any scientific reports that were out there, and anything that comes out of the commission, and say, this is the right answer. A living shoreline is appropriate here, or it is not. And so that is how we landed on that, and I will.
Senator Stewart has a question for you, Jay.
I'm just trying to understand, Jay, when you talk about wetlands, are you talking about tidal wetlands that exist or have been eroded, or are you talking about what is now subaqueous bottom that maybe the state owns as a result of erosion? And ask that question because I guess it's twofold. I mean, there's a place for a rock berm that you then create sand behind and you can plant grass, and that in all effects is a living shoreline, and not as good as some you'd like, but it's the only thing you can do in some areas, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that's a really important point, Senator, and one that I think has gotten caught up in people's concerns about this bill, is that VIMS is not going to tell someone they have to do a living shoreline if it's going to put their property at risk. They're not going to look at a neighborhood that has nothing but bulkheads and then tell one person that they've got to put in a living shoreline and become the inundation point. There is the best available science also includes a lot of common sense on what is going to be the appropriate shoreline treatment here.
Senator Stewart.
And really what I'm thinking about, I get the bulkheads, but you see a lot now, and I don't know the terminology. What are they, armor stone growings or berms or something?
Yeah, there's a lot of technologies,
Actually
Fleximat.
causes sand to accrete now that you can plant seagrasses in, and you got a little bit of an inlet where the water flows in, and you're actually creating wetlands.
Yeah.
That's what we want to do, right? I mean, that at the end of the day, that's the sort of thing we're trying to do. Creates great fish habitat, it cleans the water, it disperses the wave action. So is that what you're referring to as a living shoreline, I guess is my question?
There really is a spectrum from, what you would call, probably the greenest of living shoreline, where you're just using sand and, intertidal grass plantings, to some of the engineered products that you're talking about. I think right now there's a really exciting working group that's going on under CZM funding that's really trying to create a lookbook which will provide specific examples of all the potential solutions that are out there, and it really runs the gauntlet from pure natural materials to some of the exciting products out there that are recycled 3D printing solutions, some of the things that are happening in Delegate Hodges' district, and I know he'll bend your ear on it if you want to learn more.
Hey, Delegate Hodges, you want
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following up on that, appreciate that question. Back in 2022, I actually had legislation that provided for other structural materials to be used in living shorelines. Newer technologies, they still have thank you, Mr. Chairman. They still have the elements of a living shoreline. The problem is they're still getting hung up in the permit process. And I'm not saying, VIMS still, you say best available science, and VIMS does excellent work, but they also have to understand the legislation, the intent of the legislation, so they don't get wrapped up. And that's what I'm seeing right now as the holdup, because with this definition, we now have 38 companies that want to do business in Virginia because of the other technologies. They can decrease the cost of a living shoreline by up to 80% in many cases. We even have 18 companies that we're looking at to start a resiliency part just around this to solve the problem for the state. The problem is we still have these folks that are looking at it in a different way, in a different lens, and they get wrapped up in the permit process. So even though they're, we've named them as, the place to go for living shorelines, they're still getting wrapped up. And And how can I say it? We often make our decisions based on feelings, but instead of moving forward in the best way with the best possible science to solve the problem, which this legislation actually did. And we're not looking at that legislation to solve the problem in Virginia because they still have the elements of a living shoreline.
Yeah.
And I looked through your presentation, it doesn't mention that at all. But that's the way we have to move forward and use those newer technologies to be able to solve the problem, decrease the cost, and help our property owners.
Thank you, Delegate. I will say we're very excited about some of the new technologies. I think when we look at the general permit that is offered for living shorelines, the hang-up that we're seeing in some instances really is VIMS and the state making sure that we're staying in line with what the Corps expects for us for a general permit in living shorelines. And like any new structure, we do the same thing in agricultural BMPs. There's a new idea. It's got to go to a work group. They have to figure out how to best implement it in a way that makes sense. So we do have some really exciting technologies. I think the agency and VIMS and other thoughtful folks are trying to work through what does a best management approach look like using these technologies, and also making sure that they're mitigating any potential downsides. Any new covering for the bottom, there's going to be trade-offs. Their summer flounder need to get into the bottom. If we put a concrete mat there, they're not going to be able to go there. So that's one of the questions that VIMS is looking at. Is there a way for us to space these things out in the matrix better so we can still allow for coastal habitat to meet that definition of living shoreline while still taking advantage of these exciting products? So I hear you, and I also hear your frustration at the timeline. I can't speak for VIMS, but I do get the sense that they are trying to work towards best outcomes.
Yep. Yeah, Doug Hodges, one
Thank
more
you, Mr.
question.
Chairman. I think, the living shorelines definition in the legislation is fairly clear in the intent of the legislation. And we've had other states that have already looked at this, so work groups and surrounding this. The science is there. Other states have classified these as living shorelines. So, holding this up in Virginia, I think it's frustrating to homeowners if we're not moving forward when the science is already there and we need to look at it in a different way to move forward in Virginia. And I think we really need to start moving in that direction.
Thank you, Delegate. And I think you have representatives from your region that are involved in a CZM process that's developing that lookbook. And I know everyone's pretty excited about that because it's just going to help accelerate deployment. And so I think in the coming months, we're going to be able to see some of these things move along quicker.
All right, Jay, last two slides.
All right. Okay, so this takes us to SB 730. We've talked about this, that the bill was coming at this question of that under the premise that the 2020 legislation somehow altered the right to repair. And the language makes that assumption that the right to repair was altered, but as we've heard from Delegate Hodges, and you will hear in more detail from Ms. Peabody, there's been a longstanding OAG opinion that is crystal clear on the right to repair in Virginia. It says, provided you don't impact wetlands, you're on the same footprint, you absolutely have a right to repair your shoreline treatment, and that you do not need a permit for it. And that has been not only the case for longer than I've been alive, but it has also been how MRC has acted for all of that time. Nothing that happened in the 2020 legislation alters that in the slightest. And so what would happen were we to promulgate regulations is it would really lead to sort of regulatory uncertainty, because right now there's only one place you have to check on whether or not you need a permit, and that's, are you impacting wetlands? If yes, go get a permit. If no, go on your merry way and fix your shoreline. If we were to start listing potential shoreline treatments and picking an arbitrary date of July 1, 2020, which again, in no way changed the right to repair, it would just introduce confusion to the local wetlands boards and the commission, who are then reading, I have to permit this, but I also, there might be wetlands impacts. And that's tying a hand behind their back. If we, as I already alluded to, if you have an instance where someone's shoreline, their bulkhead is in such disrepair that they have significant wetlands behind it, they absolutely need to mitigate for that. And they also need to have a conversation with the commission about what the best treatment is there. We can't go back and start filling in wetlands for bulkheads that have fallen into complete disrepair. So if the intent of the legislation was to make sure that the right to repair was clear and was there, we're covered. And I think you're going to hear that again from the Marine Resource Commission. But if the intent of the legislation was to grandfather folks in after, along with wetlands impacts, that's not in the interest of the state's resources. It's not in the interest of our ability to adapt to climate change, to protect our waters, and to help our communities plan for increased flooding. So,
I think Delegate Krizek has a question for you.
yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have you seen any applications since the 2020 law where people thought that they were going to have, that there may have been an impact to wetland, but there really wasn't, and they did just want to repair it, and then they were still turned down, or there was other delays?
Actually, that's a really good segue into the final slide. As of right now, there have been 0 instances where someone wanted to repair a structure with no impacts to wetlands and they were turned down. There are 0 instances. There have also been 0 instances where somebody wanted to repair a structure with no impacts to wetlands and we're told, no, you're going to have to tear this down and build a living shoreline. It's a boogeyman. No board is going to do that. The commission's not going to do that to someone, and VIMS wouldn't support it to an established shoreline treatment. The 2020 tidal wetlands law, as you're going to hear in Ms. Peabody's presentation, has actually just been incredibly successful. We've seen living shoreline application rates start to climb for the first time after trying for decades to get widespread adoption. I've kind of beaten this horse, so I'm going to let it go. What I'll just say in closing is, were we to try and grandfather in any of these practices, regardless of whether they impact wetlands, which I suspect is part of the drive here, it will hamper Virginia's ability to meet our Chesapeake Bay obligations and to help our communities respond to climate change. And that's just the bottom line. So thank you all. I really appreciate this.
Thanks, Jay. Okay, now let's get on with VRMC. Ms. Peabody.
Hello. I'll wait for my presentation.
Good afternoon.
So I'll start. I'm Rachel Peabody. I'm the Director of Environmental Policy at the Marine Resources Commission. And when my presentation comes up, the goal of my presentation is to give kind of an overview of tidal wetlands permitting in Virginia and how the Living Shoreline Policy ties into that and how it's changed over time. So just very quickly, at the Marine Resources Commission, we are in charge of the regulatory review of impacts related to marine fisheries, including recreational and commercial and fishing landings, marine habitat, so that's tidal wetlands as well as submerged lands. So we have about 6 permit writers who look over about 2,700 applications a year, over 9,000 miles of tidal shoreline here in Virginia. And we do manage 1.5 million acres of the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. We're also in charge of shellfish management. So today we're talking about our Tidal Wetlands Authority, which you'll find in Chapter 13 of 28.2. This chapter was established in the late 1970s and has actually changed very little since then. In that, the chapter tells us that we shall preserve and prevent the despoliation and destruction of wetlands while accommodating necessary economic development in a manner consistent with wetlands preservation. And the way we do that is there's a model ordinance within that chapter, and each locality can voluntarily take that model ordinance and start their own wetlands board, in which they would follow the rules as legislated. If the locality chooses not to, then the VMRC will act as the wetlands board in that case. So very quickly, so tidal wetlands jurisdiction starts at the low tide line and moves up to mean high water when there's no vegetation, and 1.5 times the tide range when there is vegetation, which is generally where you see that saltbush line. So in Virginia, we do act as the coordinator of the joint permit application. So all joint permit applications, any impacts to tidal wetlands come to the VMRC. We review them and we send them out to any other regulatory body that would have some type of regulatory authority in the area. And that's going to be mainly the Wetlands Board, VMRC, DEQ, and the Corps of Engineers. So any joint permit application is going to have at least 4 regulatory bodies reviewing that application, as well as sending a letter about their jurisdictional determination. So once we get the application in, it's going to be reviewed by the Wetlands Board for completeness. Generally, the applicant will receive letters of request to confirm questions, get additional drawings, things of that sort. They will schedule a public hearing. At the public hearing, the board will make a decision on whether to approve or deny or modify a particular permit. And a decision has to be sent to the applicant within 30 days of that hearing. A record of the hearing is kept by the Wetlands Board. The VMRC in that case is the appeal board. So if a decision is made and the applicant would like to appeal, they come to the commission. And the role of VMRC staff members is to help the Wetlands Board as well as the applicant get to a place where we have an application that is approvable, but also make sure the record is ready so during appeal we can go through the appeal process. And after the commission reviews and makes a decision on an appeal, there is still another appeal process which can happen through the circuit court. The Virginia Institute of Marine Science is our codified scientific arm to VMRC in our decision making. We look to the Office of Research and Advisory Services, which has 4 full-time scientists. They will write advisory reports on our request, telling us what the best available science says about a particular project. And VIM's reports are highly weighted during permit review for this process. So living shorelines, the concept of living shorelines has been in VMRC's wetlands guidelines since the early 80s. We just didn't call them living shorelines. However, in 2011 is when the codified definition of living shoreline was implemented, as well as living shorelines were established as the preferred method rather than the default. And this is the most recent update to the definition, which was last updated into 2021, which has a broad definition that it provides erosion control and protects and restores natural shorelines through strategic placement of plants, stones, sandfill, and other structural and organic materials. In 2020, SB 776 was established, which moved living shorelines from being the preferred method to the default method. So now the first thing we want to ask is if an application comes in that is not a living shoreline, we ask why that a living shoreline can't be designed there. And I will show you a number of reasons why there are lots of cases where a living shoreline is not applicable. The legislation then asks that we update our guidelines to develop integrated guidance for the management of tidal shoreline systems, as well as told the commission that we shall permit only living shoreline approaches to shoreline management unless the best available science shows that such approaches are not suitable. So following 2020 and 2021, we did update our guidelines. We had 4 public hearings. VIMS put together a scientific review panel to update the best available science in our guidelines, and we also held a public hearing at the commission. So we are up to date with the best available science. We do communicate that living shorelines are the default approach to shoreline stabilization. We are ensuring protection of shoreline resources from sea level rise, and we have identified preferred shoreline management approaches when a living shoreline is not possible. So in those guidelines, it'll say if a living shoreline is not possible, the next step is we would like to see a riprap revetment or some type of hybrid living shoreline where you take living shoreline concepts and you integrate them into your design so that we can get nature-based solutions throughout. There are also a number of reasons why a living shoreline wouldn't be suitable, and here are a number of those. There could be water depth, existing other natural resources, large boat wakes. All of these things are to be considered by the Wetlands Board for determining what the best available science does say about the right project, the right application at that project. So I was asked about our maintenance and repair. As Jay explained, in 1984, we received an AG opinion from Mr. Gerald Beliles that said the replacement of a bulkhead is to be considered normal maintenance, meaning it does not need a permit or a review from the VMRC. If, however, there are wetlands that will be covered or impacted as a result, then a wetlands permit will be required. There's also a code section of our submerged lands that does require any person that has created a bulkhead or a riprap revetment that they are responsible for the maintenance or removal of that structure upon its abandonment or its falling into a state of repair. So there's an assumption that people are going to need to repair their bulkheads, and that in that case, we do have our AG opinion that says normal maintenance and repair is covered and does not need a permit from the VMRC.
Rachel, I think Senator Stewart has a question for you.
I do, because I thought of something else when you were saying that. What's the punishment if you don't maintain it or remove it if it falls into state of disrepair? Is there any?
That's a good question. I don't think there is any by the code, and generally we've never held anyone accountable for maintenance and repair until they come in with another application to do other work, and we ask them to repair some type of their failing structure.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stewart.
This issue has come up in another context. Would this apply to an abandoned duck blind?
So we actually don't have authority over duck blinds. That's the Department of Wildlife Resources.
Okay. Well, but it's on subaqueous bottom.
Yes, it's a very confusing situation. I could get back to you on that if you'd like me to.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, Senator Stewart, it's another sore spot for those of us in Fairfax County. We don't want any duck blinds.
Mr.
I
Chairman.
didn't say that. Yeah, Delegate Bulova.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess following up maybe a little bit on what Senator Stewart was saying, and so we've looked at the permit process. We're really focusing on that right to repair. And I guess what we don't ever want to happen is somebody assuming that they can have the right to repair when in fact maybe they are disturbing wetlands that would throw them into some kind of enforcement jeopardy. And so I guess my question is there any process that you all have where somebody can get a very quick, short form kind of blessing so that they can go in and know for certain that they are able to do what they think they can do without getting into trouble?
Yes, sir. So our staff members, our VMRC staff members, go to every single project and are always available for site visits. So the first thing I would recommend is have one of our staff members out there to make a jurisdictional determination. We will also always go with the Wetlands Board person, the Wetlands Board member. And so I would say that the process right now is just to invite us out, and we would probably give a very quick jurisdictional determination at that time.
Okay, thank you. And I guess, Mr. Chairman, to sometimes the degree of the ease of being able to do something like that. And so it's one thing to be able to pick up the phone and have somebody come out, and that makes sense, I think, for a lot of people. It might be very helpful if you have some kind of short application, or not application, but just a official request to come do something like that.
Yes, sir.
And that might be a good trigger to give somebody that comfort level that indeed we haven't changed the law, and that you can hold yourself harmless in that regard.
Yes, sir. We can work on what that process could look like. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Delegate Bulova. Delegate Krizak thinks that's a good idea too. I think what our next presenter is going to talk about a little bit is some of the uncertainty associated with repairing when you don't know if you're really in or out. So
Yeah, we'd be happy. I mean, our goal is to try and streamline the process as much as possible and make this as easy as possible for the homeowners to get their permits. So we're happy to entertain any ideas to do that. And then the last slide here, you can't see it, but over the years, each time Living Shoreline applications are growing, and you can see last year the amount of applications for Living Shorelines were significantly higher than riprap revetment and new bulkheads.
Rachel, did the structures approved graphs look the same?
So our database doesn't I don't have a way of getting that data really easily. That will be, hopefully, we'll get there. This is pretty darn close to what the application approval is as well.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions for, that's it for you, right?
That's it.
Any other questions for Ms. Peabody? Nope. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And by the way,
Thanks for
members of the
having me.
commission, I totally messed up and forgot that we have a whole bunch of new members, and MJ reminded me that we ought to probably introduce ourselves before we go any further. We should have done it at the beginning, and I totally blanked. So why don't we start down with Delegate Tran, and come on down the aisle, come on down the dais here.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm Kathy Tran. I serve the 18th House District, which is parts of Southeast Fairfax County.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delegate David Bulova, representing the 11th House District, which is the city of Fairfax and parts of central Fairfax County.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Alfonso Lopez. I'm the delegate from the 3rd District, which is South Arlington and parts of the city of Alexandria.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Amy Laufer, House Delegate District 55, which is Nelson, Louisa, Albemarle, and a little bit of Fluvanna.
This to work. Well, it doesn't want to work now. But anyway, I'm Keith Hodges, delegate for the 68th District, so Virginia's Middle Peninsula, Gloucester, Matthews, Middlesex, King, Queen, Essex, and So anyway, good to be here. Represent a little bit of
Richard Stewart, I represent the 25th Senate District, which is, holy cow, King George, Westmoreland, Northumberland, Lancaster, Richmond County, Spotsylvania, Caroline, Essex, Middlesex, King and Queen, and King William. I have a lot more shoreline than Delegate Hodges has.
We overlap, though. That's good.
And again, I'm Scott Serval, I'm the chairman, represent the 34th Senate District, which is all of the freshwater, tidal, wetlands, shoreline in Fairfax County on the Potomac River.
And I am the delegate. My name is Paul Krizak. I represent the 16th Delegate District, and I have that same shoreline that Senator Serval has, almost about half of it, I guess. And I'm only one small portion of one county, Fairfax County.
I'm Senator Dave Marsden. I chair the Agriculture, Conservation, and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate. I'm the 35th District, which is Annandale, Springfield, Fairfax, Central Fairfax area in Fairfax County. And I think I have a lake. I think that's it.
I'm Russet Perry, Senator for the 31st Senate District out in Loudoun and Fauquier counties.
What news? I'm Brian Bayford. I'm in Gloucester County, Virginia, and I've been involved in the water industry pretty much my entire life, one way or the other.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Darius Clark, delegate representing the 84th District, which is parts of Chesapeake, Suffolk, Isle of Wight County, and the city of Franklin, have a lot of the James River and the Nasman River.
Awesome. Well, thanks for everybody for introducing, and welcome to the committee for those of you who are new, or the commission for those of you who are new. This is taking a little longer than I expected it would, but why don't we get over to Mr. Zaragoza, who's from Mount Vernon, who is a shoreline property owner, has been sort of in communication with us about this, and also a member of our local Mount Vernon Civic Association Environmental Committee that's been focused on this. And you promised me it would be 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Larry.
My name is Larry Zaragoza. I'm a resident of Northern Virginia. I am in Senator Serval's district and Delegate Kruzik's district. One of the things I firmly believe is the environment is really important. We need to take care of it. And I am of the firm belief that we need policies that produce results. And one of the things, and also I think we need them to be durable. They need to be able to withstand legal challenge and ideally have citizen support. And I think that's the way you get the greatest success. I'm not sure how to work this. Okay, got it. Property owners pay a premium for their property. If they want, particularly if they're on the water, they pay that premium because they care about nature and the water. And generally, you're not going to have shoreline stabilization structures unless they're really needed. They cost more money. You have to maintain them. want to highlight a couple things about the Virginia Living Shorelines Law. From my perspective, I'm seeing little change. I fear that it's going to result in a takings of property. It actually discourages maintenance of structures because once you submit a permit, you kind of don't know what's going to happen and what's going to be required of you. It's then up to the Wetlands Board in Fairfax County. Then, because of that uncertainty, there's a lot of resistance that is coming out from waterfront property owners. And it's really because they can't anticipate what's going to happen once they enter into the permitting process. I would also note that there's been successes in Virginia that have been really great, where there's been outreach, there have been grants, and people have kind of known what the outcome is going to be when they submit a permit and they request a living shoreline or whatever. And the education really changes that. And I think if we could work in that kind of constructive way, we would get much better results. I want to go through a couple things about Fairfax County. First of all, there's widespread community concern. Major organizations' community concerns have expressed concern, which Senator Serval and Delegate Krusek are all aware of. Also, I want to note that we have one applicant that I'm aware of who requested a living shoreline. In order to accommodate the living shoreline, he's having to move his pool and move part of the house. That's not a cheap venture. Then you have another case where someone thought they could repair their existing bulkhead by right. Contractor comes in, starts the work, they stop him, and then they're told they have about 200 feet of non-tidal shoreline, of non-vegetated wetland. That's a relatively small amount. But this process is now going on for about 3 years, and the Wetlands Board has just issued a restoration order for them, and they're counting all of the area that was excavated behind the bulkhead, which was part of the construction, as part of the area that has to be made into a wetland. So that kind of thing really scares people because this particular property met the criteria that Delegate Krusek and Senator Serval laid out in a letter, whereas if you have non-vegetated wetlands, you're non-vegetated, no impact on vegetated wetlands, and you're in the same footprint, you should be able to maintain it. That is the situation this person had, and it is going to be quite expensive for them to repair if they have to do that. I would also note that there's a question about it actually being that takings might be an issue. I would note the Supreme Court basically has, U.S. Supreme Court, has basically said it's not as simple as having to take everything and make it worthless. It's much more complicated than that. I'm happy to provide much more information on that, but it is a genuine concern. The big concern that people have a lot of times is, I agree with a lot of the statements that were made, but you can have the same footprint for a bulkhead, but in order to address climate change, you have to raise the height of the bulkhead if you repair it. Otherwise, it's going to be overflowing with water. And so as a result, we're hearing from local county and also state staff that we can't do that you can't raise the height because that changes the parameters. You're changing the dimensions of it. So that is an issue. Just to wrap up, I'm taking a little bit more time than I meant to. Just to wrap up, I think what we have with the Living Shorelines Law is, I think it was well intended. I believe that we basically want to get to a situation where we have as much natural shoreline as we can get. But when you end up having a situation where you're having to push the living shoreline up into the property that's going to get closer to structures, then part of that property, which was valued by the property owner when they purchased it, is being lost. Value can be hundreds of thousands of dollars easily, and maybe, and certainly the loss of use. It is the kind of thing that is going to cause continued resistance and continued concern. If it were as simple as being able to replace or repair a bulkhead, as I've heard other people say, it would not be a big deal. I would also like to note that Mark Eversole, he was our VMRC representative. And when the Living Shorelines Law came about, he basically told me that that law changes things so that we can no longer count on being able to repair and replace a bulkhead. I will leave it at that. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thanks, Larry. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Zaragoza? Nope. Okay, yeah. Doesn't look like it. Thanks, Larry. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Delegate Hodges has one. And I have some questions for Rachel.
I really appreciate the presentation. One of the things I've noticed is between localities, there's no continuity between the wetlands boards. What happens to Fairfax County, my counties, or wherever it may be, things will, it's just totally a different world. And we were seeing some problems and issues, and one of our localities saw some issues with our local wetlands boards. We actually had where the husband and wife, the chairman was, and his wife was doing a lot of the permitting. They couldn't even get a quorum because he'd have to recuse himself, and they couldn't get a quorum. And it was a mess. And then, we had projects where they were trying to mitigate for non-tidal wetlands. And it was a big problem. The county, the Board of Supervisors saw the problem. They dissolved the wetlands board. And everything then goes to the RMRC, which has actually worked very well for them. So that's an option. I don't know if BMRC wants that, but that's something possibly to look at if you're having problems in a locality.
Isn't that true?
I
don't think that was a question for you, Larry. I think it was more of a statement, a reaction to what you said.
Something to look at.
Yeah.
Well, as I understand it, you're from Middle Peninsula, is that correct?
Middle Peninsula.
Yes, so my understanding is you have 2 wetlands boards that have been dissolved, and there's a third one right now that's going to be in question. It is a very difficult law to interpret, and that makes it really hard for wetlands boards and also for the public. Thank you.
Okay. Where'd Rachel go? She out there. Hey, so, sorry, Ms. Peabody, I guess the question that raises is what does VRMC do besides the appellate process to ensure the law is being enforced consistently across jurisdictions that consistently interpreted? I mean, I know with an appeal process, the appeals can be interpreted consistently, but if there's no record of what's decided and it's not published to the wetlands boards, I'm not sure how they're supposed to understand the policy. I mean, what do you all do to clarify the?
Yeah, so for example, when SB 776 was established, we sent out memos to all of the wetlands boards as well as did training to all of the wetlands boards on implementation of this. Obviously, some things have been updated in implementation as we kind of learn through some of these conversations. But I think the biggest thing that we do that we feel pretty proud about is that our staff members go out to site and are at every single wetlands board in every single application. So the goal is that there's never a time that the wetlands board or the applicant doesn't have a person with them that's helping them through the process and helping build that case so that when it does get to the appeal, we have a full record that's ready.
Okay, so, but Ms. Pam, I guess my question would be, that's good the wetlands boards have the information. Is that information that's been promulgated out there anywhere so that applicants can see it to help guide their thinking so they have a sense of predictability about the process? Is it like in one place, like resources for applicants or something, or what?
Yeah, so the Virginia Institute of Marine Science has what they call their wetlands guideline book, which is available on their website. That's updated on how to work through the process. That's the best book we have right now. That is how to work through the process. It talks about everything about how we handle violations, how we handle living shorelines, all of that, and that's maintained on the Virginia Institute of Marine Science website.
Okay, Senator Stewart, you have a question?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and so. And VMRC does a very good job on this, Mr. Chairman, because I go to some of these hearings and there is always someone there who's helping applicants and helping the local wetlands board. That was actually my bill that Rachel was talking about. It has created some confusion in the communities, and some of the wetlands boards actually never adopted those updated ordinances, and as a result, they cease to exist, and some of them, I don't think will continue to exist, and VMRC will have to take all those hearings over in the future. But my question, Rachel, is this. I listened to the gentleman who gave us the presentation, and I'm not as familiar with this area as I probably should be, but generally speaking, you're talking about the headwaters of the Potomac and the creeks, areas up there where it's relatively narrow. There's not a lot of fetch to speak of coming across. It really is exactly where we want a living shoreline, right?
Well, a living shoreline in theory is great everywhere. In practice is not always applicable. And so, if this is a shoreline that has a bulkhead on either side or has a pool behind it, or there are other things that we need to consider, we wrote the guidelines and contemplate the guidelines in a way that gives us the ability to be flexible to accommodate those needs. But yes, generally, a lower energy shoreline is definitely the place. Shallow waters, low energy is definitely the place we'd like to see.
Mr. Chairman, these are the areas that a living shoreline are the most effective at growing seagrass and cleaning the water, providing habitat for wildlife in the water. That is what I thought in those particular areas. And I looked at some of the photographs the gentleman provided, and he was talking about people having to move their pool and perhaps their house. But I see this on the bay and on the rivers, and I spend a lot of time out there where people will put a growing and then a berm out. And it may be 30 or 40 feet off of their existing shoreline, and then you come in, you backfill with sand, and you plant the seagrass. And so rather than ask this gentleman that question, I wanted to ask you, why can't you do the same thing up here?
You can't. We do allow, and honestly, we would allow more generously encroachment into submerged lands. So we allow encroachment into submerged lands to accommodate living shorelines just for that reason. There's oftentimes where there's not upland available. And so if there is a structure that's close and grading the upland is not the best idea, then we do allow further encroachment.
Go out, let the sand accrete, plant the grass, let it do its job. Mr. Chairman, sorry.
It's all right.
So how do I ask this? Is this a Fairfax County wetlands problem? Can we help them?
How dare you?
Can we help them try to understand what we're trying to accomplish? I'm not sure what you accomplish by taking more land. I get to the gentleman's point, but if we can create a quarter or half an acre of wetlands to do the job we want it to do, and use subaqueous bottom to do that, seems like to me we've done a good thing.
Yes, sir. I would say that right now Fairfax County is louder than the other counties of their concerns. This is not a major concern that we hear from all of the other localities. And specifically, like Jay mentioned before, this argument could have been made prior to 2020. This is more of, it seems like a jurisdictional argument about wanting to get a permit to do work on their property rather than a living shoreline concern.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stewart, and I know Delegate Krizak has a question or a statement.
And I'm not disparaging Fairfax by any stretch of the imagination. Actually, I'm trying to help because I know this has become an issue for you all up there. But I think that everybody understands this is the goal of the legislation, and it's what the agency wants to do. Maybe you could get the director to provide some guidance in the form of a letter, just sort of setting out what we anticipate, versus regulations or versus us having to take this up with legislation. That may assist the Wetlands Board up there a great deal. Just a thought.
Delegate Krizak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there any resources out there to cost share with homeowners to do these living shorelines where there's a big expense?
Yes, sir. So DCR and their Soil and Water Conservation District has coverage. There are a number of other grants in other localities. One of the goals of VMRC is that we will be more of a clearinghouse for where people can get those. But right now there are lots of opportunities for homeowners to get cost share for those programs to make that easier for them as well.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Perry.
I just have a couple questions. And it sounded like the gentleman who was up here earlier had a number of concerns, one of them being just general uncertainty over process, over costs, uncertainty generally. So I guess my first question, one of them related to taking. Can you tell me how many takings have occurred across the state?
So I know that that's a general argument that comes up. My understanding is that this is not a takings, that we're not asking to take property. We're just asking to how that property is developed.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman?
Senator Perry.
So you're not aware of any takings that have occurred across the state? Okay. Another question, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Okay. And can you tell me what the average timeline is across the state once I have submitted my permit request to get an answer back on, hey, yes, this is what you need to do, or no, you don't need to do anything? What's the timeline for that generally, average?
From start to finish, a permit should be in your hands by 90 days. Generally, we say 3 to 4 weeks. You should have your first interaction with the permit writer.
Mr. Chairman.
Yep, Senator Perry.
I echo Senator Serval's comments about reaching out and education, and Delegate Krizak's comments about cost sharing. I think my last thing I would sort of ask about is, or comment on, is something Delegate Bulova said, and this goes back to the anxiety over, do I even know that there is a permitting process, or maybe I need to ask because I just want to replace my bulkhead that I already have. What's so wrong with that? It's my property, right? But it just makes me sort of think of the idea of, I forget what it is, 811 or whatever, know before you dig, right? Yes. Just sort of setting that up as a general idea. Hey, before you dig in the ground, you have someone out. Maybe the same thing here. Before you start adjusting your line, you just reach out and do that, and maybe just some policy around that, or outreach.
Absolutely. We'd be happy to.
People, I had another question related to that. I know the situation that Mr. Zaragoza described, which I know Delegate Krizak and I think Delegate Tran are both also familiar with, because she used to represent the homeowner that happened to. But are you aware of whether or not, as part of the contracting process, the licensing, when you get your Class A, B, C license, whether or not they test applicants on wetlands rules, so that a contractor doing work might know they need to get a permit for something versus not? Do you have any idea about that?
So there's actually not a contracting license that covers living shorelines at the moment. There are marine contractor licenses, but there's nothing for people who do kind of that intertidal living shoreline process. And so my understanding is that there is not training to contractors for the regulatory process.
So my next question then would be, are you aware of scenarios that have occurred like this, where some contractor had no idea a permit was required and just started doing work for a homeowner without realizing they were violating, a state wetlands law, where they need to go to wetlands board and get a permit?
So we have been told that by contractors, that they were unaware whether a permit was needed, they were not aware a permit was needed.
After the fact?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. So just, listening to this, it sounds to me like there's a couple different areas out here that are sort of causing confusion, et cetera. I think the lack of awareness in the contracting community might be one, which I'm not sure how we would address that, but there's probably some ways we could think of to address that. But secondly, I think Senator Stewart suggested his suggestion that you all provide some guidance, at least to the boards where they're having these issues, might be useful. And thirdly, I think Delegate Bulova had a good suggestion, I think, about, what was it, some kind of an expedited form to figure out jurisdiction, yes or no, before you act. I don't know if you all could maybe chew on that.
Absolutely.
Get back to us in the next, a couple months about your thoughts about that, and we can hear about it maybe at a future hearing about whether or not legislation is needed or something. Yeah, Delegate Bulova.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that would be very helpful. Again, the uncertainty going in, and being able to just quickly determine whether or not you have to get any kind of permits or whether you have a right to repair, I think would be very, very helpful, and to have that in a succinct format. I also really am interested in some of the contractor training. For me, it's kind of intuitive that if you're going to be monkeying around in something that looks like a wetland, that, you're going to look in and see whether you need to get a permit, but I realize that's not universal. I was reminded by Delegate Tran that this is also an issue with resource protection areas and doing work in RPAs. And so maybe we can kind of tackle both issues, with some targeted training. So I don't want to micromanage what that might look like, but it's something that might need to be on our radar to ensure that, again, people don't inadvertently do things in RPAs or wetlands and then get in trouble after the fact.
Yeah, we'd be happy to evaluate that. I know DEQ is currently working on training programs for a number of their permitting processes, so we can see how they're rolling those out and start working on it.
Yeah, I would just note, well, but not every. I mean, a bulkhead doesn't always look like a wetland, right? It looks like a bulkhead to a lot of people, right? But and the RPA is a big problem. I sued a guy who dumped 200 dump truck loads of dirt in an RPA. I had no idea what he was doing and created a big freaking mess. Senator Stewart.
To that point, in the RPA, DEQ's jurisdiction, and you all go from mean high to mean low?
Right. We stop at the 1.5. We stop at the salt bushes is where we stop. 1.5 times tide range.
But you all certainly work together, I assume, in these things.
We very much try to. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, so report back to us a couple months. Enough time.
Absolutely. When you guys are ready for us, we will be prepared.
All right, and then we'll see if there's anything to do after that. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Cool. Thank you for those presentations. It was all very interesting. Mr. Zaragoza, thanks for coming down. Ms. Peabody, thanks for coming up from Hampton Roads, and Jay from the shore. 9,000 miles of shoreline. It affects a lot of property owners. It's important we get it right. Next on the agenda, we have House Bills 1295 by Delegate Campbell, who was going to try to appear with us, remotely, but we're having some kind of technical issue. And she gave me a statement here. I think am I supposed to read this or say what? Okay, so I'm going to read this statement from her. You have the bill in front of you in your packet. Then I think you must be Mr. Mest.
Yes.
And I guess she asked you're from Master Water Conditioning Corp. I think she wanted you to say a few words.
Yes.
As we consider this. And I think this is a bill that was referred to us. I don't believe it got out of the House, I think. Is that right? MJ, do you remember? Ms. Cottrell, do you remember?
No, it was continued.
Carried over in the House, right. So we never even saw this in the Senate. So Delegate Campbell writes to me, first, thank you for having me. I patroned House Bill 1295 in the 2024 session. Ultimately, we asked for it to be continued to 2025 due to lack of funding for the legislation. This bill would require the Board of Health to create regulations for point of use or point of entry drinking water supplies. We would also like to establish a fund utilized by the Office of Drinking Water to first test, then treat contaminated water supplies for people using private wells and rural public water systems. This is important not only for my district in the Shenandoah Valley, but for the entire Commonwealth. I believe that wherever we look, we will find contaminants in our water systems, which is a major issue that needs to be rectified. While this bill might be a small impact for the Commonwealth overall, I believe it will be a worthy investment for many of our constituents. I'm certainly not an expert in the field of water quality, so I was happy to make the connection with Richard Mest, who will be able to handle any questions about the program and what exactly we can accomplish. Thank you, Delegate Campbell. Hey, Ms. Cottrell, can you briefly describe the bill? Have you looked it over, Council? Oh, sorry, different council.
Mr. Chair, I'm just going to read the summary if that's all right.
Go for it.
The bill directs the State Board of Health to adopt regulations to utilize point of use or point of entry drinking water treatment or filtration to remove or significantly reduce concentrations of contaminants of concern that meet or exceed any maximum contaminant level or health advisory for the same contaminant adopted by the U.S. EPA. The bill also establishes a rural water supply program and fund to allow the Department of Health's Office of Drinking Water to test and treat contaminated drinking water for individuals on private wells and small rural public water systems.
Got it. So it's Mr. Smith's bill. Okay. Thank you for that. All right, Mr. Mest.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee members. My name is Richard Mest, and I'm part of A.O. Smith and president of a division called Master Water Conditioning. Most people know A.O. Smith for water heating, but we are getting heavily involved in water treatment to make a difference for Americans. I spent a lot of time talking to organizations like your fine organization here, trying to make a difference for everyone that drinks water. And when it comes to contaminants, PFAS has sort of introduced a new phase of conversation. In the past, public water systems were regulated by the federal government, and private well owners were sort of on their own. States' rights, which it needs to be, but they sort of were lone fish when it came to treating contaminants. PFAS is agnostic to water source. You cannot blame a resident of Virginia who chose to live in the country and drill a well. You cannot blame them for drilling that well near contamination. They didn't drill their well beside a waste site. They didn't drill their well beside industry. PFAS found every well in the state. So PFAS is a game changer. And what this HB 1295 does is puts a marker down for the state that says that the state will help constituents that are currently underserved by programs. They are private well owners, and in this state, there are 1.6 million residents in Virginia that get their drinking water from a well. 613,000 households. Also, I want to share that in rural America, in rural Virginia, there are a lot of small public water systems that are underserved too, that need help. And in the state, there are 2,659 public water systems that serve less than 3,300 people. Out of that, on the community side, there are 924. Average serve 494 people. Non-community, non-transient same people, so schools, places like that, there are 499 in the state, average of 727 residents served. Non-transient community, not serving the same people, so more like a restaurant or something like that. There are 1,236 in the state serving an average of 113 residents. PFAS, as I said, is a game changer, but there are other things too. And in this HB 1295, it not only talks about PFAS, but talks about emerging contaminants. And just want to share quickly some of the history of emerging contaminants. The Safe Drinking Water Act mandates that the EPA every 5 years vet contaminants of concern. After that, they then have to monitor those so they're uncontrolled or unregulated contaminants. So far, since 1998, there have been 414 contaminants looked at of concern, 414. Out of that, 141 have been monitored by big cities, public water systems, monitored by a small percentage of small public water systems. The most recent, called UCMR 5, has 29 different classifications of PFAS chemicals on it. There's one other, lithium. So out of 30 being monitored in the U.S., 29 are PFAS related. PFAS is everywhere. PFAS is in our clothing. PFAS is in the carpet. PFAS is everywhere. 20% of your engagement with PFAS is through water. 80% is not. So this is a holistic view, but we need to help. Finding the source of PFAS, the state's doing a great job with that. Find the source, cut it off, manage it, and then what do you do to protect people? As you all are aware, the EPA finalized their MCL for PFAS. It's a class of PFAS including Gen X. Gen X was a replacement for PFAS. It happens to be worse in drinking water than PFAS itself. Last count I heard, there were over 13,000 different types of PFAS out there. Water is a solvent that loves to consume things. Dilution is a solution. Heard earlier about climate change. If you don't get precipitation, you don't get dilution. If you don't get dilution, your surface water concentration of any contaminant goes up. So this HB 1295 is a huge opportunity to plant the flagpole to say, in the state of Virginia, we're going to find funding, and the request is $5 million per year, and we're going to help rural people in Virginia. We're going to help people on small public water systems. We're going to help people on private wells who need help to, number one, identify through water analysis if the contaminant exists. Number two, utilize best available technology that's called point of use and point of entry. I want to quickly share what that is. So raise your hand if you've ever seen a pitcher filter. Anyone use like a Brita pitcher? That's a point of use. Point of entry would be if I put water treatment in your home and I treat every ounce of water that goes through your piping. Point of use is actually strategically going to the point of most impact and treating it there. So some contaminants in water allow you to do maybe something on your faucet, maybe something in a pitcher, maybe something underneath the sink. Other contaminants require you to treat whole house. There's a process called ANSI. NSF ANSI is a process that creates testing standards. Every public water system has to use ingredients that touch water. It has to pass one of those classifications. That's typically called NSF ANSI 61. When it comes to treatment technologies, not only do we have to prove we'll do no harm by putting water through these devices, we also have to prove efficacy, that they'll actually do what we promise. And that has a joint committee of a large, transparent group of stakeholders that constantly review standards to update those. So our thought here is that when Virginia reaches out to help the constituents, that you demand that the products that you might fund are actually certified to do what they say they'll do. And that's what that process is. So when you see NSF ANSI referenced, it's just a third-party process, and there are a lot of different entities that test to that. Some people know UL from electric. NSF ANSI is sort of on the water side. The rural water program, I think that's huge. Again, having a flagpole planted to say that moving forward, we recognize that we need to help people in rural Virginia. And that also, again, includes not only private well owners, but people on small public water systems. I don't know if you got to read the budget office did a review, what $1 million would provide and $2 million would provide and $5 million would provide. What's important to know there is that you have to know what's in the water before you go to treat the water. So like the 5 million mark is 6,480 water samples being done and 510 systems being provided for people. Just imagine 10 years from now, how many people are going to be helped through this? Emerging contaminants never stop. PFAS started as an emerging contaminant through the EPA's process. There's a lot more coming down the pipeline. So using PFAS as a driver is really smart to do, but understand that there are a lot more there like lithium and things like that. You also have existing contaminants of concern here that have MCLs that this references. So things like lead, things like arsenic, and some heavy metals. So with that, I'm here to answer any questions. I thank you so much for the opportunity to be in front of you. I thank Delegate Campbell for presenting HB 1295. Apologize that she's not here. Hopefully I did an adequate job in her behalf. And at A.O. Smith, and I want you to know it's beyond us. We have 2,600 member companies in a group called Water Quality Association. Member companies. We're a resource for you. So if the state has a water quality problem, you can reach out and we will find you bright people that can give some advice out there. It's not about business, it's about making a difference. So thank you very much, and I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mest. I see 3 green lights to my right, and before I turn it over to, and I don't know who was first, second, or third, but but before I turn over to them, I just want to remind the commission, I think it was 2 years ago when Delegate Bullock was chair, we heard a presentation on PFAS point source contamination. I think we got a presentation on Roanoke and sort of a general presentation where it was coming from, which is basically from all over the place. And then last year, we endorsed 2 budget amendments, which made it into the budget. They kind of got combined for those following at home. Item 280 in the final budget to appropriate $500,000 for the Virginia Department of Health to do a cost analysis for implementing new PFAS regs for local water systems, and also to implement the pending EPA rules on lead and copper. And my recollection is at the time last year we got the presentation, when Fairfax Water spoke to us here, they said they were looking at spending $1 billion to comply with PFAS. And that's Fairfax's water system alone. And so, this is clearly an issue, which is why we put this $500,000 in here to try to figure out what the overall cost is, to then figure out whether or not the state ought to start some way to help systems with this situation. So that's in the works, and the report, is due back to the chairman of House Appropriations and Senate Finance and Appropriations by December the 1st of this year, which maybe we'll have a meeting after that to look at all this. So having said that, Delegate Krizek, then Marsden, then Perry. Krizek, you're first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, and Bulova too. Okay.
The
I have. Oh my God. Oh, you guys on the screen or something?
Is there?
I don't know how this works. Okay.
All right, you ready for me, Mr. Chairman?
Okay. Well, Krizek, Marsden, Perry, then
Mr. Mess.
Lopez, Bulova.
I wanted to ask you what the definition and what you're considering rural water and rural water system, and why not include all of the 613,000 households that get water from well. In fact, I have in the suburban Mount Vernon, I have about 300 or so households that use a water well. One of my constituents who's sitting here on my left, he has a water well. So I was wondering if you could just opine on the reason for that, and if there would be a way to expand that.
Yeah, it's really financial restraint. We would love to be able to help 613,000 households. But again, our advice was to start small, get the flagpole in the ground, and then build from there. So prove concept and build from there. But you're absolutely right that all 613,000 deserve to be protected and get safe drinking water.
Great. Then Senator Marsden.
I'm good, thank you.
Senator Perry. And by the way, for the commission, I don't have anybody on my screen. Doesn't show who's in the queue or anything, so you got to wave at me or something. So, Senator Perry, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I was curious. I went out and took a trip out to Loudon Water and had an afternoon discussion with them about PFAS the other day. And they indicated to me that basically they are in the process, that there's a lot of processes going on right now that are in, trying to deal with this, right? Trying to grapple with how to deal with PFAS, how to get it out of the water, how best to, and it's very expensive and it's hard. They're very hard to deal with. Are you aware of the emerging technologies that are being developed that are coming about to try to help deal with this?
Yeah, so great question. I could be here for a week to help answer that, but PFAS is, we need to look at PFAS holistically. There has to be a start, and I applaud Virginia for doing the analysis of PFAS sourcing to take a look at where it's coming from. There aren't a lot of manufacturing plants of PFAS, but PFAS is an ingredient in a lot of things that you have unintended consequences. You just don't know. There's conversation about once you concentrate PFAS, and the technologies are there already. So there are a lot of technologies that are there and are proven to do it, but they take time to work. So as your systems grow in size, they grow in size. And there's a direct correlation to flow and price. And that's why you're hearing $1 billion for a big public water system versus $500 for something for a homeowner. It's a magnitude of size. So there are some medias that are being developed that can hold PFAS in a different way. But typically the way that you treat for PFAS right now and in the near future is going to be to concentrate it. So think of it as a sponge, a chemical sponge, and it has X amount of capacity to hold PFAS. And then the question is, what do you do with that? Because now you've concentrated it. So another thing, Senator Perry, I want to share is there's a difference between remediation and treatment. Remediation is taking it from the environment and then never allowing it to come back. Treatment is totally different. And sometimes in conversation, we get stuck somewhere in the middle. So as you're aware, there are regulations for toxic waste, which obviously PFAS is. And there are some real challenges when it comes to what you do with the spent media. Most importantly is what we do with sludge from public water systems waste site. What do we do with that? Do we continue to put it on fields, farm fields? What do we do with it?
Mr. Chairman, if I can just follow.
Senator Perry, go ahead.
Yeah, and my point, I think, is mostly that we are continuing to work on new technologies that hopefully will be more efficient and better at doing it and maybe, fingers crossed, cheaper. And then just one more point, the $5 million number in here is incredibly interesting to me. I represent northern Fauquier County as well as western Loudoun County, where we have a number of wells and other systems, and certainly I consider it to be rural. And I think the Fauquier estimate to clean up PFAS is $44 million. So slightly above this $5 million estimate that's in this bill.
Yeah, I would love to have 100 times more money than this, which you articulated very well. We need a lot of money to solve the problem. But again, there has to be a start. So if $5 million is too low, raise the bar to whatever you think you can manage as decision makers. More is better, for sure. You're welcome.
Thanks. Delegate Lawfer.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I think Russet just took what I was going to talk about. Louisa County, 1,200 residents on public municipal water, and they've just increased their cost 24% to the clients, and this is really important issue, especially for the rural areas. I will just champion the ruralness of this because there's so few ratepayers. Taking on this kind of cost is super prohibitive, and $5 million seems pretty small, and I hope we can work on this going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just share. So the EPA received 120,000 comments to their rule. I read 1,800 of those, just sort of zeroed in on treatment technologies. And there are lawsuits stacking up, and we'll see where the MCL ends up. But right now, the allowance, the health advisory, the previous health advisory was 70 parts per trillion. That was based on the sensitivity of the water lab analytical equipment, right? That's now 4. That's why they chose 4. But they have an MCLG, which is a goal, and the goal is a goose egg, 0. It's 0. And I just want to share what a part per trillion is. As these instruments get better at finding smaller things, a part per trillion is like finding a postage stamp on the ground in the state of Texas. Wrap your head around that. And the new health advisory is in parts per quadrillion. So again, water loves to touch everything, and everything in water has a size. Just like you dynamic people that thank you so much for what you do. You all have a personality, you all have a size, you all have an energy. Everything in water is the same. PFAS, bacteria, lead, nitrate, everything. So imagine if they can find smaller increments of things, they're going to find more of us as contaminants in water. And remember, every 5 years, they look for more. And then they test for more. And by the way, every 5 years after that, the EPA has to look at least 5 contaminants that might become MCL promulgated.
Okay, Delegate Lawfer.
I have one more question. With the private well owners, what are you imagining? Because obviously when you put the well in, we test the water, but how frequently after that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you. So The other part of HB 1295 is the maintenance of it. So maintenance isn't just replacing the medias that concentrate the contaminant. Again, small systems are just doing what the large cities are doing, right? Just more compact. And actually, they're a little more dynamic because they can do multiple things because of the way they're made. But they have a capacity. So part of the maintenance protocol will be testing as well as replacement. Now, testing is really expensive today, but I'll also share that there's something called a surrogate. So when in Virginia right now, when you have your well tested for bacteria, they test it for E. coli, which is a surrogate for a lot of other microbes. And for volatile chemicals and synthetic chemicals, there is a surrogate that represents 70 different ones. So you test for one, it represents potential 70. So when you design treatment technologies, you only test against 1 versus 70. There is nothing for PFAS now, but the Water Quality Research Foundation has a project right now with the University of British Columbia where they think that they can identify a surrogate for PFAS that 1 might represent 12 to 14. That's going to be huge. Once we get that, then all of a sudden, when it comes to monitoring performance for maintenance, you test 1 versus 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, whatever that concoction might be. So there's some promise in that technology too.
Hey, Doug Lopez, did you have a question?
Several of my questions have been addressed in terms of the sort of the fabrication that is the $5 million, and sort of why it was $5 million. Because if you think about what has been sort of beaten into members of the House, at least for the last 10 years, is that, well, addressing any aspect of safe drinking water is too costly.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for instance, at one point, it was told to us that to even change the pipes in some of the older communities, which have lead pipes, and to address that, it would be around $16,000 to $20,000 per household.
Mm-hmm.
And so $5 million would be 250 houses, and we're talking about a Commonwealth of 8.9 million people. I guess what I'm concerned about in terms of CERCLA, in terms of Superfund, in terms of the new regs that have come out of the EPA, and I also appreciate the fact that you've got you're concerned about 5 more contaminants and that need to be tested for, when in fact we're talking about thousands, millions of contaminants or cross-contaminants, and how the federal government, because of its issues with testing and how slow that process, not slow, it's glacial. It's a glacial process of testing for the contaminants in the environment. With regard to the new regs that came out in the EPA, what is the impact going to be on farms and on farmers if you have a lot of these people using wells right now, and you are actually, and they're not going to meet the standards? What's going to be the impact on a lot of these farm operations? And can you walk us through what happens when their wells fail the test?
No, I can't, but I might teeing you up. Maybe you can help with that. But no, I can't. But user in on, you hit the bullseye of concern. And a lot of farms use biosolids for fertilizer. And remember COVID, they track COVID in cities by checking for COVID in the biosolids and waste treatment plants. So waste treatment plants are the concentrator of a lot of these. The biosolids are going on fields. The fields have PFAS in them. Actually, at the Water Quality Research Foundation Symposium this past year, we had the premiere of a movie made in Maine about a farmer who used biosolids. The state said use them, followed the guideline, and then because of PFAS, they shut his dairy farm down. So in my lens is, what do you do for the farmers? How do you keep their livelihood moving forward? And what do we do with the biosolids? Are we going to Are we going to allow biosolids to be used? Because, again, this is just my humble opinion, but if we don't find a secondary source for biosolids, you're going to have a real problem, because try and find waste sites to put the biosolids in. So the secondary market for biosolids is lively and is very effective, but when it comes to PFAS, what do we do with that? And there's a lot of information. There's actually a biosolids organization that you can track. I can send you the information with them. There's a lot of work being done by them with testing. And what I've read so far is that when you look at the dilution of it, and if you control what you use, you might be okay. But you're exactly right. If you're a farmer and you have PFAS in your water and you have PFAS in your milk, you don't sell your product. You don't sell it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Doug Bobo.
Never mind, I guess it's on. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess one question, just for clarification up on subsection C. Does that part only refer to public treatment works in terms of installing the technology that you're talking about, or is that broader than that?
This would be for the private well owners and for small public water systems.
Okay, so C is meant to cover everybody.
C is meant to cover private well owners and people on small public water systems, or that all are small public water systems, yes.
And then follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Doug Bobo.
I guess the first follow-up is for at least the public water treatment systems. I guess hasn't this been usurped by the EPA's new rules? And so I guess my understanding is that if you've exceeded that 5 parts per trillion, either you have to reduce your sources to get below the 5 parts per trillion, which I think would be the optimal solution, or after a certain period of time, I forget whether that's 3 or 5 years, you'd have to install the technology. And so I'm just curious whether current events at EPA have usurped, at least for public treatment systems, what you're anticipating in C here.
Yeah. Maybe you can help with that later too, but no, so actually I applaud the EPA in how I don't agree with everything with their program, but I really appreciate them allowing current testing to be used to meet the 5 years. So right now, as of June, I think it's maybe the 20th? I forget the exact date, but June is the marker. And then 5 years from now, so you have 3 years to continue monitoring for the presence of PFAS for every public water system. You have 3 years. But if you're already in the testing program through that UCMR5 I talked about, that you can share that, because there is inadequate water analytical lab capacity in the country to handle every public water system and hit their quarterly markers. So the EPA has relaxed that a bit. For smaller systems, they've spread that out. Instead of quarterly samples, it could be yearly, could be every 3 years that you test. So they've spread that out. So right now, by the rule, that you have 3 years for public water system has 3 years to test. After that, they have 2 years to come up with a plan to actually treat for PFAS to meet the MCL. So you're 2029 before a public water system is mandated to meet the MCLs that have been published. It's 5 years.
Doug Bobo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess pivoting a little bit to the private well systems, I'm just trying to understand some of the practicalities of how that would be implemented. And also, if you could kind of reiterate the additional cost that is associated for doing this on a private well system. And so is this meant that anytime you have a new permit to drill a well, that you would have to automatically be installing this, or would it be based on testing of the water before you drill the well? I guess I want to make sure that our efforts are focused on places where it's an actual problem before we make the cost of home ownership and drilling a well go up significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And those mechanics are not finalized yet, but we would envision it working off of the test data that you've accumulated as a state through your program. You know pretty much where, you know where hotspots are currently. So you would want to concentrate in those hotspots because you don't want this to be a forced regulation on every new well necessarily. But what you want to do is if you have a constituent who is concerned about PFAS, do research to find out if it's present, and that would be a water analysis. But there's so much data out there from USDS, from the UCMR data the EPA has. There's adequate data for the state to know where the hot spots are and concentrate there. That would be the recommendation. And back to the 5 million, we were advised that 5 million probably wouldn't scare people, realizing that 5 million is very inadequate. You can use that up in water testing really, really fast.
And Mr. Chairman, one last comment, if I could.
Yeah, and I don't think you also realize that the vast majority of the Water Commission members were from really big jurisdictions that liked really big numbers. But Delegate Bullock, go
So
ahead.
that's a beautiful segue, Chairman Servo. And I guess I would reiterate the concerns about limiting this just to rural waterworks and private wells. So I live in Fairfax County, but I actually have a private well that we operate under. And so this is a huge, huge issue. I think as Chairman Servo mentioned, Fairfax Water anticipates that this would be anywhere from $700 million to $1 billion to be able to retrofit theirs. That's a hefty increase in rates for those utility payers. And just because they're urban doesn't mean they aren't fiscally stressed. And so I'm thinking about places like Petersburg, I'm thinking about places like Lynchburg, I'm thinking about places like Richmond. And so I have no doubt that at some point we're going to have to develop a fund to help take some bites out of this and make sure that we're taking some of the sting out of installing the technology once we've exhausted source control. But I think that we need to take a more holistic view than what's in here and think about what we're going to need to be able to get Virginia across the finish line, because the health of any Virginian is going to be paramount. And so I don't think we can or should divide that up depending on whether you're rural, urban, suburban. But
yeah, agreed. Again, trying to design language to start something and be as holistic as possible. I totally agree with you.
I think Delegate Laufer has another question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that is correct. I mean, Albemarle County is much larger than Nelson and Louisa. And I've taken a tour of the Albemarle facility. Now they have a carbon filtration. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are like some kind of like really heroic efforts to mitigate some of these pollutants. And maybe, Mr. Chair, if I can suggest, Mr. Chair, maybe in after December 1st, after the first wave of this happens, maybe we can have an update and look at some of the statistics of the larger jurisdictions versus the rural and where we're at with all that.
And also, I want to share, Mr. Chairman, that the EPA, U.S. Congress in March changed an appropriation in the BIL, and they appropriated $1 billion for states for underserved communities, including private wells. And every state has their amount of money through the state revolving fund that could be available and could be used for small systems and private wells. That's something you probably want to take a look at too, and we're working in earnest to try and figure out the mechanics of that. But it will reside at the state, and you can see exactly how much money you have available in that fund, and that was in the beginning of March of 2024. We found out about it by the Director of Drinking Water in a meeting in May, and we're working hard to figure out the mechanics of that too. So the EPA is recognized through PFAS that there has to be protection for beyond large public water systems.
Great. So first of all, thanks for the presentations. I think it's clear that we're going to have a lot more work to do when it comes to the PFAS, and we don't even know about lead and copper yet. But it sounds to me like we need to be thinking about how to sort of step this in stages, because I guarantee you the money committees aren't going to be too excited about giving up millions of dollars for anything. And so the way this is sort of the state, there's going to have to be some state, maybe a pilot or something. We're going to have to figure out some way to start getting our arms around this process-wise, and commission members need to be thinking about that over the next 10, 11 months. I see Delegate Tran needs to be triggered. You want to say something?
Mr. Chairman, I think the speaker just mentioned that the state is receiving money.
The state has money
available.
They have it available, yes.
Mr. Chairman, it might be helpful in a future commission meeting to hear from the state how they plan to deploy those funds that are going to be available for the private wells. And, like, for example, do we compel people that they have to test their wells? Do we go out? How do you access all those types of questions on private land?
Right.
But I think that would be a good presentation for a future meeting.
Yep. Would have been nice to know about this when we had all that ARPA money, but I think we're about to hear about that from Mr. Rollban in a second. But does anybody else have any, in addition to Delegate Tran's suggestion, any other sort of homework that we ought to get done before December so that we come into December prepared to come up with some kind of recommendations about how to deal with this in the next session? Because it sounds like there's... All right, Delegate Lopez.
We'd like to know, not a politically expedient, but a realistic number in terms of what it would take to address well issues and PFAS and the new circular regs at the federal level across the Commonwealth. We'd like to know the actual number of wells that would be affected. I would like to know what the percentages of, or what the actual number of wells are that are affecting farms in the Commonwealth. And I'd like to know what it's going to cost. I mean, I really would like to know what the actual cost is going to be at the end of the day. Because if we need to be establishing some kind of, revolving loan fund of $1 billion or something to address this over the period of 20 years, it's better if we do it now than later.
Got it. And I think some of that's going to be answered in the report we get, not all of it, but we'll definitely get some answers on that before December to the extent we can. Any other ideas anybody has on anything, any other homework we need to get done by the agencies? You can always send me an email in the meantime and I can get it off to staff. Delegate Laufer, you have something you want to say?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to suggest maybe it's something like the abatement fund, how we found out how much money was per locality. I don't know if there's something from the federal government is issuing these funds for certain community size, et cetera. Maybe. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else? No, well, I think you're on to something. What we're going to do with it, we don't know yet.
Well, thank you very much.
But,
and I overheard
but this is a
pilot
good
program.
idea. It's just sort of like the end game as opposed to the middle game, I think.
Yeah, and I want you to know, so again, A.O. Smith is a resource. The industry is a resource. We have a research foundation that is looking for pilot programs. We align with Virginia Tech, and they do a lot of research on our behalf. So we have a strong presence in the state. And again, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you. Look forward to helping you all, help everyone in Virginia get the best drinking water. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the presentation. All right. Well, those two topics took longer than I expected, but it's a lot to talk about and important stuff. And I already have a couple other topics for next meeting as well, but we still have Mike Rollban to give us two things, two reports. One is an update on how we're spending the state's ARPA money on water and sewer issues. And then after that, number 6 on the status of the Water Quality Improvement Fund methodology and effectiveness, which is something that the former Ag chairman thought we ought to be looking at last year, but we ran out of time. So, Mr. Rollban, welcome back to the Water Commission. You're always here.
Good afternoon, Senator Serval and members of the Water Commission.
Yep.
Thanks for inviting me again. I guess it's always fun to come. I'm going to talk about a few topics. They follow the generally the agenda, but Senator Serval gave me a couple other things to mention, so we'll have it all combined. So I'm going to give you an update on the SLAF grants, the ARPA program, the WQF, and the SWIFT project. So in terms of SLAF, this table gives you an overall summary in terms of how much money we've authorized, how much is actually, some of the grants have been withdrawn, people didn't do it, a few were partially withdrawn, and then we have the number that have been actually executed. We have a lot of pending grants, and I'll talk about that in a second. We have about 37 million available. We estimate right now that our fiscal year 25, which is just starting, or July 1st, we'll have about a demand of 27.7. The actual applications start in August, so we don't know the exact number yet. I'm going to point out that Scott Morris is here. He's the director of our water division, as well as Brandon Bull, the director of legislative policy. And we've reorganized this, the finance portion of the water division to do a better job, because you'll see there's a lot of pending grants that some of them go back to 2019. So we're working on this problem. And this is the program of improvements that he is focusing on. And these are the goals. The first is we're including a mechanism to revoke the grant authorization for non-responsive groups. There's a bunch of municipalities that apply for things but don't respond with the information we ask for. So we're just going to revoke them, okay, and free up that money to give to other people. We're working on a third-party review program for efficiencies to, again, eliminate this bottleneck that's happened. We're modifying the grant agreement to make it a template. Right now, each one is a kind of a bespoke agreement. You know, they're negotiated to the nth degree, and things are just not getting done. So it's simple. You want money, this is the terms, and we'll give it to you. But you got to agree to it. We're trying to simplify the entire authorization process. We're doing things basically that we did in other programs already, and it's worked. We're going to work on a streamlined program. And I will mention here, by the way, we've hired a third party to help us also reorganize this area and make it more efficient. And then we're also looking at something that helps more rural, small counties and localities, which is right now, a lot of them don't win any of this money in the program. And the reason is they don't have the money to do the design and construction and permitting, I can see you're agreeing, to be able to qualify. So municipalities have a lot of money, get it all designed and permitted, bid out. They know exactly what they need, and they put them on the shelf and apply as they're ready, or as the grants are available. And it puts a lot of small localities at a competitive disadvantage. So we're going to be breaking it up into two types of SLAF grants. One is to give them the seed money to actually get through the process to be able to win the big grants. Okay, so that's our overall program. You know, we're focusing on one thing at a time. And I will mention all the finance groups, we were in the 1980s, maybe, the way we're handling this process. We're in the midst of upgrading our entire DEQ database system they upgraded last in 2003, which was a Y2K project, 3 years behind schedule. And so we couldn't even have electronic permitting, for example, electronic inspections, and tracking all the grants electronically. So it's a whole process. That upgrade will be done by the end of the year, and we'll finally bring the grant program into the 21st century. So the second thing I was asked to talk about is ARPA. Chairman? Yes, sir. Yes.
Bova.
Thank you, Director Rowland. I just want to make sure I understood your chart here with the one before that. So I guess the second to last line, funds available for the fiscal year 25 solicitation, so 37.2, and then we've got the SLAF needs assessment. So it sounds to me like we've got adequate funding for fiscal year 25, and that will carry over potentially $10 million to fiscal year 26. And then depending on what that needs assessment looks like, we'll have to augment that $10 million. Am I reading that correctly?
You're reading that correctly. But what we're also trying to do is go back and audit all the programs and find out who needs money. Because some of these old grants, they probably don't need them, or they've finished the project. So it might free up some money as well. So that could change that calculus. And then we don't know exactly, we have a needs assessment, but we don't know what people are going to actually submit applications for in August.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. So, new topic, ARPA. We had a big problem early in this year when we got a budget that said we had to have the money spent or obligated by June 30th. The budget bounced back and forth. We kept that June 30th as a goal because we didn't know until a few weeks ago what that end date would be. We reorganized and refocused. I signed personal letters to every locality that wasn't responding and said, you know, you want your money? Respond to our staff or forever hold your peace, basically. And that worked. So this was our goal line, the red line. You know, we spent a year and a half, 2 years trying to get to the little first dot. And at the end of May, we actually had every ARPA grant taken care of. So the good news is we met that original goal, or the new revised goal. Now it's, I think, September, October, but it doesn't matter. So now we're into the obligations grant program. So this is an S-curve. We haven't refined it by working out with every locality, because each project will be different. But typically, when you design and construct projects, the expenditures are a typical S-curve. In the beginning, you're doing design and permitting, it's kind of slow. Then you do construction, it ramps up real fast. And then, as you know, the last 5 or 10% of a project takes 30% of the time. And so that's why it kind of tails off. So this is just an aggregate. Obviously, a lot of individual projects are going to have different schedules. But what we're going to try to do now is Scott's team is going to be working with each grant recipient to what's your projected, and then we're going to track their progress against the projection. And that way we'll know if you're behind or ahead of schedule. So right now, if they had started a couple of years ago, they would have been much farther. We're really just getting going. So we're going to try to push everyone. You've got to spend the money before the end of 2026 or you lose it. That's the way the rules are written right now.
So that's it for ARPA, right?
Yes.
So it looks like.
Hold on.
I got it.
All right.
Sorry.
But it looks like the government cash from the post-pandemic is still continuing to slosh around 6 years post-pandemic now, which might explain why our economy continues to churn away. Delegate Lopez, you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So our ARPA's been in place since March of 2021.
Yes.
And you're saying that it took us a couple of years to get, and it's really treble or quadruple funding for a lot of these major programs at the federal level that's available to the federal government, or to the states, mostly through state revolving funds, but a lot of it's through grants you have to actually apply for.
Correct.
And can you go back to the previous slide? Was that 9, 8 grants you applied for? And
55 grants.
No, that's 55 grants. I'm talking about in January of 2024.
Oh, yeah, there were only, roughly 9 grants.
So it took you 3 years to get 9 grants.
Correct.
Let me just repeat that.
Yes.
It took you 3 years to get up to 9 grants when there are billions of dollars available.
Correct.
Can you tell me what the rate of return was in other states of similar size and wealth?
I don't know what the other states are, but I do know that
I could probably find out.
Hold on, Delegate Lopez. You got to go through the chair. You got to let me answer and go through the chair.
I will tell you that the primary problem was a lack of response from grantees asking for the money. So what happened to make the change was, number one, we've reorganized the staff. We have, number two, I personally signed a letter that Scott's team wrote that tells these people that weren't responding, you have to respond if you want the money. And that made the difference. And part of it was the budget. And I got back talk from a couple of people that they didn't care that the deadline was moved up to 6:30. The federal deadline is the end of 2024. So our staff pushed, and we have made a difference. And this started a year before I was here. And it is a lack, it's an interesting problem where people want the money, but they don't want to actually do the work and get it going. Unlike, say, for example, Alexandria, that's the most phenomenal jurisdiction you've ever worked with in terms of, the combined sewer system, compared to that to some others. It just depends on the desire to get things done. Not sure what I said that was funny, but
now you're talking about the Stewart-Surville sewage tunnel.
I'm sorry, Director Rolban, they had a slight push in getting that done.
Yeah, I understand they did. Right. But this budget pushed this forward, because by proposing 6:30, all of a sudden it's like, hey, we got to get it done.
Okay, Delegate Lopez, another question.
Mr. Chairman, I would just comment that the funding's available only for a limited amount of time, 5 years, and to really get going halfway through the process, it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever, considering the fact we've basically left billions of dollars on the table for programs that we could desperately use in the Commonwealth of Virginia. and is now going to North Carolina and Illinois and Idaho. And so I understand the issues, or I think I understand the issues that you're raising, but
The money isn't going anywhere. It's here because we obligated it in time.
yeah. I'm just trying to figure out what happened last year, the year before, when the money was there and it's not on this list. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, any other questions about ARPA before we move on to the Water Quality Improvement Fund? Delegate Tran, you have a question?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, a question for the director. Can you help me understand if any of the ARPA funding is available just at the state level, or are they all then kind of like must be allocated to local governments?
These are all allocated to local governments.
All of these grants?
Yes.
Or how about the remainder of the funding that you're waiting to?
Yeah, everything's been obligated.
But it is all at the local level, so there's no grants that we administer at the state level?
Exactly.
Okay.
Minister, but that's because of the budget we passed,
Yes.
right? Because I think some of us in the legislature had other ideas for that ARPA money, but the money committees decided that they wanted to go to this instead of things like funding the park maintenance backlog, or I had an amendment to fund outdoor bathrooms at every high school in Fairfax County and some other things that the money committees didn't want to do. So this is a program we created that we all directed to them, right?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions on this, on ARPA? Okay. So the money's going out the door. All right. Now the next one is the Water Quality Improvement Fund. And I know, again, the former chairman of Ag, prior to the last election, this was his idea going out the door, which was that we put a lot of money into this every year. And he had a lot of questions about what we're spending the money on, whether we're spending it smartly, whether we need to sort of look at whether it ought to be reallocated in some way, something like that. And we actually had a budget amendment asking you all to look at that, but the money committees didn't adopt it. And so I thought we'd get a presentation from you on sort of what your all's thinking is on this right now.
Thank you. And this is similar to what we talked about last year. And I will say the VAMSA people, Chris Palmer represents them. He is going to be working with Scott Morris's team a little more to refine some of the numbers because we do have some slight discrepancies. So it's a continual improvement. The first thing is there's currently 11 active agreements, a fund balance of $694 million. In the next 2 years, our projection right now is we only need $35 million, so there'll be a fair amount of money still in the fund. However, and this is the current active agreements, so we have about $176 million in current active, dispersed at $56 million. We have a bunch of potential projects that are in the queue that total almost $1 billion. Okay, so when you then add the potential agreements in, we have a deficit. So we have a fund balance of $659 million, a 2-year need of $976 million, the $300 change million deficit. Now this does change for multiple reasons. Projects come in and out. Escalations continue to occur. We're seeing a lot of inflation in these costs. And but we're obligated under state law, this is something I learned when I first got here, to sign the agreement even if we don't have enough money, which as a private businessman I was a little surprised about.
So can you repeat that? Just so I'm clear, like a locality can come in and say that they want a piece of this money and y'all have to sign it even though there's not enough money in the fund to pay for it.
Correct. And there's a section in the contract, in the agreement, that says that basically I'm giving them an IOU, they get an IOU if we don't have enough money. The General Assembly hopefully will make up that need, but we report in every year for these needs. It's an interesting construction, but it's in the law. I believe Taylor Murphy was the patron of it many years ago. And if you meet these requirements, if you're qualified, we give you the grant, but we may or may not have the money. And it forces the General Assembly to either fund the project or explain to local governments why they don't have enough money. So there is.
Do you have any other program where we allow local governments to obligate the legislature before we
this is the only one
appropriate the money?
This is the only one I personally know of.
Huh. It's bizarre.
It's I think it's a problem where, kind of like Delegate Lopez mentioned on the PFAS, where we don't know the exact cost. We don't know the exact cost here, and the problems keep coming in, and I think Delegate Bulba has the answer.
Well, no, I guess I was
Delegate
going
Bulba.
I was going to provide the counterpoint, quite honestly, that this is probably the more honest way of funding vital systems like wastewater or drinking water. Because otherwise, if we don't get those requests in, we'll shortchange it every single time, right? And so these are really, really important. And I guess I want to defend a little bit the current system, that if it meets particular criteria for public health, safety, and welfare, we've got an obligation to make sure we're doing our fair share of that. And the fact that it's expensive, that's just a fact of life. But I'd rather budget this way so that we are ensuring that we are getting those projects implemented and holding our feet to the fire.
Stewart has a question.
No, I want to follow up on Delegate Bulba. I think he's exactly right. We spend a lot of money on a lot of things around here, but we're actually determining the need and the qualifications here before we allocate the money, and I think it's the right way to do it. I also want to remind you all that Delegate Murphy was from the Northern Neck, and he had a lot of forethought in this.
And I will add, the interesting thing here is these communities actually want the money and want to do the projects, where in the previous program we talked about, we've had a problem getting people to respond. So it's fascinating. They were given the money and they're slow. And one of them that really gave me a lot of grief is someone that Senator Stewart knows, or an entity that they know, and he's tried to speed some things up, and they didn't even want to apply for the money in a time. So it's an interesting dichotomy. Okay, so there's been a lot of success in this program. This gives you all the projects that have been funded and the total number. We spent just over $1 billion already. Okay, so there's been a lot of different projects that have happened and have done some really, really good things. This gives you a summary of, I was asked, how are they being successful? And I'll give you 2 points of view on this. If you look at total nitrogen, which is probably our biggest problem in the Bay now, we're doing much better in phosphorus. Our concentration, the amount of nitrogen in the effluent, the permits for all these grantees was allowed to be 4.7. They're achieving 3.46 as of the end of 2023. For TP, for phosphorus, total phosphorus, the grantees' overall average was 0.4 milligrams per liter. They're getting 0.2. Compliance with all the performance agreements is 98.3%. They're getting A+. So these people are doing a great job. I will give you a little counterbalance because of Senator Serville's. If you were in Northern Virginia, in Fairfax County, the Potomac embayment, Noman Cole, if you recall from the sewage treatment plant, he has a standard of 3 milligrams per liter and 0.18 milligrams per liter for phosphorus, so nitrogen and phosphorus. That's what you have to do in Northern Virginia, the Potomac embayment. Noman developed that when he was a citizen activist and then became the State Water Control Board chair, and sadly hit a tree skiing. That's why we have a sewer plant for his name. But we are doing really good compared to what their permits are doing, and so this is a success. In terms of total delivered loads from these grants.
Delegate Lawfer has a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how often are these standards changed? Like, you're asking a locality to get to a certain number?
Every time there's a permit issued, so every 5 years typically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then when we change
Delegate
this.
Lawfer.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we change the standard, are we providing more funds, or how does that work?
Typically, they would apply for another grant through this program.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. This is the nitrogen summary, and it just shows you, despite the increased population over this time period, for these grantees, you can see just graphically, it's almost a 60% reduction in total nitrogen delivered. So it's again, a very successful program. Phosphorus, same kind of thing. It's about 2/3, actually a little more like 70% reduction, despite the increasing population again. So this program has really made a difference. Sure.
About that. So I think what I was just having a sidebar with Senator Stewart about this, but how do we know when we get to a point where we're getting enough bang for our buck to keep spending money on this?
Yeah.
Because obviously a big reduction here, but.
So What is not done right now is measuring things in terms of efficiency, in terms of dollar per pound. And that's something that way back, the Senate Finance Committee presented a study on this, I want to say 20 years ago now, Senator Stewart, with the graph of the cost efficiency of different practices. I believe it has not been looked at since that last report, which is probably close to 20 years ago. But that's something personally, I think cost effectiveness should be a criteria. Traditionally, there's been a bit of a weight to sector fairness versus cost efficiency. So it's an interesting problem. We did a pay-for-performance pilot project last year with the Nutrient Credit Exchange for nitrogen. Came out at $8.02 in the end per pound of nitrogen removal. We paid them for this. You know, they had an auction basically. There was a similar program in Maryland using different technologies, and they were in the $20-something per pound, and Pennsylvania was over $200 per pound. So looking at cost effectiveness is a good way to do things, in my opinion, but traditionally it's by each sector should reduce their pollutant load by a certain amount. Okay. New topic?
Yeah. Any other questions about the Water Quality Improvement Fund? Okay, Delegate Lawford.
Thank you. What are we doing with the localities that can't seem to meet the, like the reduction?
We file notices of violation. If they don't perform, then we do a consent order. If they refuse to sign a consent order, we sue them for consent decree.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. I will just say, we do on our website track that, and our enforcement program has been phenomenal. We've reduced the time to get people to compliance by 70% because we don't play any games anymore. It's simply by the books. You go through that process. They used to back and forth and fight, and everyone makes money that's a consultant or attorney, but the environment doesn't get protected. We just follow the process. SWIFT, that was the last question Senator Serval had. As you know, there's a pilot project in York River that's been very successful. We're treating the water, the sewage, to better than drinking water standards and matching the aquifer characteristics and pumping it back in the aquifer, replenishing the aquifer and reducing and sometimes eliminating and going the opposite direction, subsidence that's occurring from increased pumping of the aquifers. It's been very successful, and the full-scale facilities under construction should be online by the end of 2026, putting in about 16 million gallons per day of the Potomac. I've gone there a couple of times. We have quarterly meetings, and it's a pretty phenomenal project. I had nothing to do with it starting, but it's something that people talked about when I was in college in the 70s, and they're actually doing it. There's a couple of other examples around the country, mostly California, and it's out in the mid, and I want to say Lake Tahoe area. So the question that I was asked is, what would it take to do this, to do more projects like this in Virginia? So the first thing is basically we have to figure out, this is the Eastern Shore groundwater management area, the green, that would be the primary place to do it. And what we've talked to is Virginia Tech about doing a concept study. They need 12 months. They would like $300,000. I'm sure there's a little flex there, but we could get a study done to see where does it make sense to try another one of these projects in this groundwater management area. The criteria obviously is you got to have a big sewage treatment plant, bigger the better, but not necessarily. And you have to have an aquifer that can accept those types of volumes of water. And the very upper end that goes all the way to Fairfax, for example, it's a very thin aquifer, and we don't know a lot about that area. So the other bullet I put in here, I was asked, was what would it take to get more groundwater data so we could study that upper part of the eastern groundwater management area. Our estimate is that we'd need 5 additional groundwater wells. That's working with USGS. They would actually do the installation. It would cost approximately $2 million and $100,000. We're talking about a 3-year process to get that in. Under my period here, we've added a few groundwater wells, and the process of getting an easement and getting permission and it's a horrible expense, a year or more process just to go through that. Then you've got to get USGS available to drill the wells and start collecting the data.
Delegate Krizek has a question for you.
Are you going to include that in the governor's budget next year?
That is not up to me. I'm providing information at the request of Senator Serval.
Delegate Bolova has a question if Delegate Krizek's done.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I love the SWIFT project. I remember getting our first glimpse of that at a Water Commission meeting a long time ago. And it's neat to be able to see that actually move forward and be successful. I guess the question that I had really relates to its potential applicability up in that thin slice up in Northern Virginia, and just the nature of our water sources. And so I'm thinking that the Occoquan might not be a good way to do that. And the reason I'm thinking that is because we've got that reservoir where we circulate the water, right?
Yep.
And so it comes in, we grab it, we use it, treat it, and I think you can't divert much water from that without harming the reservoir. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, but that's from the UOSA plant.
Correct.
So the Noman Coal plant, for example, could be a candidate, which doesn't go into that facility, or the Moody plant in Prince William County. I mean, there's some other opportunities in that area, but Virginia Tech would have to look at that capacity aquifer, but also the demand and the subsidence, because it might be that farther down in the aquifer, there's still sewage treatment plant capacity availability, plus there's more groundwater withdrawals occurring right now that's caused a bigger problem. So that's what they would have to analyze, because we've got much more sewage, in those plants in Prince William and Fairfax, but very little demand on the groundwater comparatively.
Gotcha. Thank you.
But by the way, the UOSA plant is obviously a national treasure. Again, I think there's only one other plant like that, a comparable size in Lake Tahoe. It's phenomenal.
Right. Okay, so, but right now you all don't have any idea of what the potential is for this on a statewide basis, or whether it's possible to sort of reach a sort of a no net loss of water from our aquifer by using a concept like this, right?
Well, that would be, so I've talked to Mark Widdowson at Virginia Tech, is the co-chair of the SWIFT project. He's the Civil and Environmental Engineering chair at Virginia Tech. We have some educated guesses, but they really need to do a detailed study to figure out exactly where that demand is and where the best opportunities are to replenish.
Right, because I know Senator Stewart has big concerns, and I suspect Delegate Hodges does too. Folks running out of water out there in the Middle Peninsula and the Northern Neck, and whether this might help at least mitigate that or stave it off for a few decades or so. I don't, right? Yeah, go ahead, Senator Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike, the SWIFT project in Hampton Roads, I think I read, was putting back in 16 million gallons a day.
Yes.
What's the total that's withdrawn on a daily basis? Do you know?
Oh, it's in the hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions of gallons a day, right. Do we know how much groundwater actually recharges that aquifer per day?
Yeah, there are good estimates of that. It's much better in the southern part of the eastern area versus the northern part, but there is a good water balance model that Virginia Tech uses as part of their modeling effort. And every time that someone applies for a permit for groundwater withdrawal, that model is actually employed to determine, how much you're taking out and what's that going to do to the subsidence and to the groundwater.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Senator Stewart,
do you know what the net difference is a day?
I don't. I could find out, but
what's being drawn and what's being recharged?
I could find out, but I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I only bring that up because I agree the SWIFT project is amazing, and we all heard about this when I was on the Water Commission 15 years ago, and I'm glad to see it functioning and contributing, but I don't want us to get our hopes up that this is going to be the answer, because we've got a significant issue with the depletion of the Potomac aquifer, and it's already affecting people in the northern part, Fairfax County. It's coming down into the Northern Neck as we speak. Mm-hmm. You and I have discussed this, and this should be a topic for this commission, at the forefront of this commission and what we're going to do about it, because we're going to have a lot of angry people when their wells go dry and we don't have any answers and we haven't done anything preemptively to deal with this issue. As I understand it, we're at a net 100 or so million gallons a day coming out of this aquifer, net loss, not regenerating it, and it's depleting from both ends. We got saltwater infiltration coming in Hampton Roads and no aquifer in Fairfax. And it's only a matter of time. So
I used to live on a well in Fairfax and Clifton. Now I live on a well in Prince William. I understand.
And we've been talking about this since I was on the Water Commission. I got elected 17 years ago. And I've not seen anything significant happen in that time period, although we've discussed it. We've put bills in. Sometimes we can't get them passed. I had a few of those this year that happened to. And it would seem to me the State Water Commission would be the place that we should take that issue on, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Stewart. That's why we endorsed the budget amendment last session to do some of this stuff that the money committees didn't want to fund. And we need to continue talking about it. Delegate Bova, you got something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Bova's probably been on this commission just as long as Senator Stewart.
Director Ryan, I know right now we're talking about permitted uses. Can you also remind me or the commission of the status of unpermitted and grandfathered withdrawals? That I understand it's a pretty large proportion of withdrawals, because I know several years ago we had tried to get our arms around just making sure that we are having better reporting of what the impacts are, and we weren't able to get that across the finish line. And so can you give us, at least for some context, about those grandfathered and non-permitted withdrawals? Because I don't want to lose sight that that's an area that we ought to be focusing on as well.
So the grandfathered withdrawals, I'm a grandfather, I should know. Okay, it's a big issue. Okay, so two things. Number one is our staff is working on analysis to compare what the grandfather withdrawals based on what people that own these things say they believe they have grandfathered compared to the actual available capacity. And the initial analysis they've done just on a few points is there's not enough water to meet what they think they can get. So grandfathering is going to be a big issue. What I've told the water community is that we are going to form an ad hoc committee. We haven't picked the membership, and we're going to look at that. It may be in conjunction with Senate SJ 25, Senator Stewart did. Jonathan Rock, some of you know, I think you know Jonathan. He's our chief policy advisor now. He was part-time since a year ago. He's now full-time. He just finished his master's at Yale. He retired as the managing partner of McGuire Woods and represented Alexander Water and Loudon Water, among others. So he's very knowledgeable in this issue, both on the legal area as well as the actual permittee area. So we are going to have a committee that's formed to talk about the problem. It's going to be informed by actual information that Scott Morris's group is pulling together, because everybody says they're grandfathered and this is how much water they want. And in a couple of instances, I've had a couple of meetings with people wanting me to say it's okay, but the amount of water they think they get exceeds the water in the river. And so, that's just not fair. I mean, it's not right. If that was the case, no one can have any more water. So it's going to be a tough meeting, a tough series of meetings. But the first thing we're doing is developing that information to be able to have facts instead of opinions. And then we're going to bring these stakeholders together. It's going to be a tough period. You'll probably hear a lot about it.
Okay, Delegate Lawford and Delegate Hodges.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering if there are aquifer maps that aren't the Eastern Shore. If there's, I'm thinking of my district, Albemarle. I know Louisa is really facing questions about how much more growth they can maintain, and are there other aquifer maps?
I don't believe there's the aquifer map like what you're wanting, because it's very localized in many of these areas. So typically, for example, like in Fauquier County or Loudoun County, you will have a geophysicist do an actual study. I had to do that I had 2 dry wells at my farm, and so I hired a geophysicist, and they did electroresistivity surveys of the farm to find where those spots were, where the water is. in a lot of these geologic formations, it's not like the Eastern Shore where there's groundwater everywhere at a certain depth. In these fractured rocks, you have to find the right fractures. So it's much more difficult, and that's why most of the time there's site-specific studies required and then actual pumping tests. I've worked on a lot of projects where you actually then have to drill a well and then do a pumping test to figure out the zone of depression around that, and it just depends on the permeability rates.
Follow-up question.
Yeah, Delegate Lawfer.
Sorry, and
then Delegate Hodges.
So is the state paying for those kind of?
No.
For the localities? Okay.
Well, or usually if it's a developer, the developer pays for it. In the larger well fields, it's the county itself when they're doing a public well field.
Thank you, Mr.
Delegate Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being with us. The way I understand the way the aquifers recharge, it's like on the 95 corridor, it's very slow. Takes years to trickle down, and like the SWIFT project, as you inject that in, it's like a big balloon, and it builds up. So not only are we replenishing the water supply, but in theory and looking at it will help with land subsidence. So maybe you could address the land subsidence and maybe the science behind that, and the long-term effects and what we're seeing. With land subsidence.
In the SWIFT project, they've installed several wells at different distances from the injection point to figure out, and extensiometers as well, to figure out, number one, what's the groundwater table doing? And it is, you have that mound effect. Just like when you pump it, you have a cone of depression. When you have the cone of depression, it consolidates the soil particles. So you're taking the water out of the pore space between the soil particles. That increased, they're no longer buoyant, so therefore they compact. When you put the water back in, it rebounds to a certain amount. It doesn't fully rebound. So what they're doing at the extensiometers is measuring the rebound. It depends on the soil type and the formation, and then also measuring the groundwater increase. So as they do that, they're getting more and more information to figure out how far it's going. We just don't have a lot of great information everywhere.
Delegate Hodges, you done? Okay, any other questions for Mr. Rolban, Director Rolban, about SWIFT? No, it sounds like we have some more discussion to do on SWIFT expansion, water quality fund.
I will add one thing on SWIFT. Just so you know, you had talked about PFAS earlier. One of the things they're dealing with right now is it ties into PFAS because there's PFAS in all the water. So they're having to spend a little more money and clean that out more. So it's everything is affected.
Great. All right. Thanks, Director.
Thank you very much.
All right, and Commissioner, we got one more thing. We had a public comment on here, but one thing I wanted to mention really quick is one of the things I intended to put on the next agenda was, which was suggested to me by, let's see, I think Bud Curtis down there was getting a presentation next time from private water systems. We now have a proliferation of water systems being run by private companies, and there's apparently some regulatory challenges associated with that, and they thought we might be good to hear about that and whether any legislation or action was needed on that. And then we obviously have a few other things. But if any other commission members have ideas for things we ought to talk about at our next meeting, I think we ought to at least have one more meeting before December. Let me know what that is. So having said that, we now have public comment. Is anybody here from the public would like to speak either in person or online?
Mr. Chair, we do not have anyone online to speak.
All right. Anybody in person? Looks like nobody in person. All right. Well, having said that or seen that, appreciate everybody coming out today for the Water Commission meeting. Commission will rise.
The Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.